The business genius that is Donald Trump sent the global economy into turmoil this week with his unfathomable Hokey Cokey tariffs policy, literally millions, no, trillions, being wiped from stocks and shares. As the markets got, to use the president's technical term, a bit yippy, the supreme deal maker blinked back down and exposed himself as the arse of the deal. Even as the odds of a US recession go from 20% to 60%, his acolytes and sycophants around him try to suggest that this was all part of the plan. But the reality is that this was a disaster for the economy and a setback for Trump. Meanwhile, back in the real world, the UK government recalled Parliament in an attempt to save the UK's steel-making capability, and the re-nationalisation of the industry is looking increasingly likely. With the backdrop of key industries under threat, trade wars, and the schizophrenic approach to policy from the White House, will Rachel Reeves feel able to finally remove the fiscal straitjacket she's put herself into? This is the Downtown Den Politics podcast. I'm Frank McKenna. We're in for a lively one.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Right, guys, great to see you this week. We could talk about all sorts of stuff that's been happening in the world of geopolitics. We've had another British MP excluded from another country, so Hong Kong. Actually stopped a Liberal Democrat entering the country. I haven't heard Kemi Badenoch make any comments on that, strangely enough, but there you go. She's probably put her foot in it more than once this week on other matters. We've also seen some terrible atrocities continuing to happen in Israel and Gaza, and of course we've had further attacks on Ukraine. But we're going to focus this week on the United States, because joining us today alongside my usual comrades in arms, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, we have Martin Liptrot, who of course is our American correspondent. Great to see you, Martin.
Thanks for the invite. Lovely to be with you at this unearthly hour, as it turns out to be here in the United States at the moment.
Well, you're in Florida, aren't you, Martin? Yeah. So what time is it there?
Currently, it's 3:45 in the morning.
Well, we do thank you very much and appreciate your time. And let's start with the tariffs and then move into some of the things that we were discussing on the podcast last week relating to what I consider to be some genuine concerns about the future of democracy in the United States, but you may be able to calm my nerves. The tariffs thing, Martin, we've said in the past, you and I, when we've spoken on this podcast, that Donald Trump, he's a contrary character. He acts on instinct, but somehow, some way, he convinces at least enough of the American public that whatever the outcome, that was the plan all along. What he's been unable to do in this chaotic couple of weeks since he announced the policy of wide-ranging tariffs, which, let me remind people, every country in the world suffered from, apart from Russia, Belarus, but two others, weren't there?
North Korea and Cuba.
North Korea and Cuba. So apart from those long-term allies of the United States, every other country were hit with these tariffs. And there's been all sorts of to and fro. But of course, in the end, it's the bond markets that have done for him. So basically, America, which owes literally trillions and trillions of pounds, it's trillions of dollars in debt, the interest rate on that debt was going up and up and up, similar to what happened with Liz Truss and her mini budget a few years ago here in the UK. and he's backed down, but he's trying to wrap this up as some sort of victory. Martin, what are people in the States thinking of all this?
A range of opinions, as you would imagine, on this. I think you have to do a few things though to kind of be able to make sense of it, because it isn't a rational set of events or circumstances. So to try and apply traditional government or administration logic is a mistake in itself. So you have to look at where we are. I think there's a challenge in what some of what Trump wants to achieve has broad support. It doesn't mean I'm a Trump supporter, but there is a recognition that the US has perhaps paid more than its fair share of the table bill when it comes to European defence. There are long-standing tariff and trade barriers that are applied against American products for a range of reasons that are seen to be uncompetitive from an American point of view, and Trump set out a stall in pre-election that he was going to do something about it. Now, there's an academic conversation about balance of payments and all the rest of it, but as a political aspiration, he curried favour and support with that approach, the idea of America first and looking out for American business interests. The manner in which he's going about doing that is, of course, where all the pain and the hardship is really being felt. So I think if we recognise that he has broad support for his intention, which is to give American businesses what he perceives to be a fairer crack of the whip in global markets, he's got good political support for that. I think the second challenge, and perhaps the one that you guys were talking about last week, is this all seems to be coming literally from the pen of one man, rather than through the complex layers of governance that the United States has in place. And frankly, the absence of Congress and the Republican Party as the majorities there is something that's a little bit concerning. And then you've got the reality of America is the largest market in the world and the largest economy in the world. And the old saying, if America sneezes, the world catches a cold, still rings true. So the consequences of us being the Americans doing strange things on tariffs and other economic measures does have an impact beyond everybody else. I think there's a couple of things out there that are probably the most important pieces of this. The first one is that the United States is carrying a debt that's around 125% of its gross domestic product. And we have a bill of the interest for that that we pay extortionate dollar values on, mainly to the Japanese and the Chinese, who are the holders of that debt. The nation knows it needs to bring that down, and it's looking for ways to do that. And this is the current administration's approach to that. That means the Fed has to act, and the Fed, as you know, is independent of the Treasury and only has a mandate to deal with inflation and unemployment. So until those two markers tick up or down, depending upon which way you're looking at them, the Fed doesn't get engaged. You'll hear Jerome Powell and others say markets are operating functionally, which means just because we're seeing massive declines in stock prices doesn't mean that it's a problem for the Fed. That's just how the markets operate. A lot of it's on sentiment, a lot of it's on fear of the future or what might happen, uncertainty. So I think we're all looking for the moment when the Fed gets involved. If interest rates do decline, which I think is the administration's goal, so therefore the payments on the yields stays lower. I think that's definitely something that's there. And then the second one is the point that I made a little moment ago about where's Congress in all this. That touches on your democracy question, because it's a check and a balance, but also it should be bringing perhaps some more sensible voices and leveler heads into the conversation. It feels as if there's a kitchen cabinet or a golf course cabinet down at Mar-a-Lago that's calling the shots here. And that's not in anybody's interest at the moment. So I think we have to say we understand the president's sentiment and we understand his ambition for what or intent for what he wants to achieve. And I don't think there's a lot of disagreement in the nation about aiming for that. The manner in which it's being achieved or gone about is where the distress is being caused.
I think, Martin, that maybe in the States there is an underestimation of how nuts the president currently looks. And particularly when on almost a daily basis he's changing his mind on these things. Over the weekend he announces, I think on Friday, maybe Saturday, hard to keep up, the tariffs were coming off anything in relation to mobile phones and computers. And then this morning I wake up to the news that actually that's only a temporary reprieve. We'll be putting those tariffs back on at some point. And then the other thing that I think he needs to give his head a wobble over, keep using this term in all sorts of different scenarios about who's got the cards and who hasn't. And you've just made the point there. China and Japan own an awful lot of the American debt. So to suggest they've got none of the cards, which were probably made in China, by the way, the cards that the Americans and the Chinese themselves have, it's a nonsense to suggest we're dealing with a Chinese regime that can be simply put in a box, as it potentially could have been 20, 25 years ago. And I don't think that Donald Trump or some of the people sat around him are nuanced enough to appreciate the new modern world that they are entering. They're trying to take us back to some sort of 1950s American era, which is never coming back, Martin, not least because you've not got enough American people who are prepared to work those jobs and actually who are prepared to pay the prices of manufacturing taking place in the United States. But I think the biggest mistake he's making is he's underestimating the Chinese.
Yeah, well, America is a vast, vast nation. I mean, the state I live in, I can drive 9 to 10 hours south and still be in it. So to try and
you can do that going from Liverpool to Manchester, Martin, but for all sorts of different reasons.
Potholes, but there's a very wide range of opinions on this. So the phenomenon of Trump is that there is a rump of MAGA supporters, the Make America Great Again, the red hat wearers, and
made in China.
And they are loyal and remaining loyal to Trump. It is a bit cultish, and you can't have a conversation with people who have those kind of religious fervor kind of views. But his popularity ratings are sliding. They're under the 50-50 mark, which was he was way above that when he took over won the election in November and took over in January, and they've fallen into the 40s now, which is poor. 100 days in. In some of the polling I saw that came out of the University of Michigan last week, voters were drawing straight lines between Trump's actions and the negative impact on the economy. So they weren't blaming Biden, as the narrative is trying to suggest. They're saying that it's Trump. So, and if you look at the sort of liberal world, if you watch Saturday Night Live or tune into some of the podcasts that are everywhere, he's getting a hammering on those things. Now, probably covered his ears to it. What you've got is, I don't think anyone's looking to go back to 1950s America. I think that perhaps the picture of that's being painted for political purposes, but I don't think that's the ambition. Dave Chappelle, one of the comedians that we have over here, said, he's like every other American. He wants to wear Nikes, not make the damn things. So there's still a consumer-facing economy here. I think the challenge is going to be that we have to accept that we're probably, with the absence of Congress, we've now got like a technocracy running the place, whether that's Elon Musk. Most important player is probably Tim Cook at Apple. I mean, that's probably why smartphones got exempted yesterday. He's got a direct phone call to the Chinese premier and to the White House. So somebody like him is probably going to do what a commerce secretary or a trade secretary would have done in the past, but do it from a non-elected and to some degree, therefore, unaccountable position. And this is the new kind of procedure that we're living in now, and we're just not used to it. We can't predict it, and the like. Congress still has the power to call any of these executive orders in, but that would take a political kind of earthquake, at this moment in time. What I think will happen is that the midterms that are rapidly approaching us in 26, and there's a couple of gubernatorial elections coming up as well, Virginia, you're going to see candidates having to read the runes a little bit more. It's not going to be okay to just be a red hat MAGA Trumpite. You're going to have to explain yourself, especially in a state like Virginia with a large military bases and a lot of government workers because of proximity to DC. People who've been laid off by the Doge kind of cuts and other things as well. So there's some political challenges and hurdles coming up where the Republicans are going to have to perhaps start to nuance a little more than the Trump is always right kind of approach they've had in the past.
Thanks, Martin. Just going to bring Joe and Jim into the conversation. Joe, we of course are watching this from afar, but it impacts, as Martin said, on the global economy and on the UK, perhaps more than most because of the relationship and the integration that we have with the United States as the UK. What are you making of it all? And of course, what we shouldn't forget when we're talking about these big numbers of trillions of dollars owed and the markets going into free fall is that these things matter to ordinary people. I was looking at some vox pops on CNN a couple of nights ago where people approaching pension age were saying they'd lost literally thousands of dollars because of the fluctuations in stocks and shares, and they weren't very happy with their president, I can tell you. So, Joe, what are you making of it all?
Well, I think that was actually what I was going to ask Martin is what do people on the street, consumers who are going to be impacted, whether it's on pensions or whether it's on the price of goods in the shops. And, whilst Trump is pivoting like a lighthouse on acid and changing his mind every 5 minutes, we've had this conversation in relation to this country. Business needs some sort of security and certainty, and he's just creating chaos. So, there will be an impact on hiring, firing, retention, the cost of things, etc., etc. So I'd be interested to know whether that is beginning to filter through to, Joe and Joanna in the street, and whether that has any impact. But the other thing, though, couple of things really. One is our obsession and the British media's obsession with Trump is totally disproportionate because, he only has to open his mouth and we drop what we're doing. We cross live to some rambling nonsense that is repeated 3 times with that tiny little mouth and those tiny little hands. And you just sort of think, hang on a minute, there is other stuff going on in the world. And that reinforces this sense that we are watching a TV show. It's like the Truman Show, which makes it quite difficult, I think, for people, A, to take it seriously, but also not to sit there a bit like Jim on the edge of his seat at the Masters, thinking, what the hell is he going to do next? And therefore, if you constantly turn to this toddler showing off and having a tantrum or whatever it is, you're not holding them to account. You're not asking the questions. And the other thing I'd like to ask Martin is, where is the opposition, either within the Republican Party or, where is the voice of the Democrats?
Yeah. So the first one about where's Joe and Joanne public. The metrics that matter move in different time frames. So 70% of Americans are invested in the stock market, either directly or indirectly. It's a much higher percentage than it is in the UK. You hear UK politicians kind of lambast people for being stock owners as if there's some kind of capitalist elite. Here, it's just a matter of life and death. We don't have a social security safety net. You have to have your money working for you. So people are seeing in a very immediate time frame the consequences of all this, because they've seen it, which you shouldn't do. But if you go and you check what your 401k and your pension plan looks like on a daily basis, it's plummeting, and that causes distress and uncertainty, which of course are negatives. Trade and the cost of goods hasn't come to us yet. Eggs are up, but that was to do with birds being poorly. The impact of the tariffs won't be felt for 2 or 3 months. I mean, there's boats bobbing around outside of harbours all around the coast of America at the moment, because they know that if they come in, the tariffs hit, and if they wait a day, the tariff might have disappeared. So the stuff hasn't gone through the supply chain and the uplift that the tariff will put on that, but it'll get there. So you've probably got an aftershock of this that's 3 months down the line, or 2 months, 3 months down the line, and that's the moment when it impacts on employment. I think I wrote something for you last week about the drinks industry and how pubs and clubs and other things will be impacted by a hike in imported alcohol prices more and disproportionately perhaps than supermarkets or other places will be. So you'll see people get laid off from bar jobs. You'll see they won't be open in the evening. They'll only be, or won't be open for lunch, only be open in the evening. Those kind of things will start to take effect. But that's down the pike, frankly. At the moment, the stock market is the only indicator that people are aware of or tuned into. So that's that. In terms of TV obsession, yeah, that's the plan. Our president is a reality TV star, and he knows that, like all good reality TV, headlines is the currency. And what drives the currency up and down is chaos. Will Jimmy be booted off the island? That's the kind of the world we live in. And Jim, you probably rue this, but our news media is entertainment media now, and it also plays to that beat. And that's not just a UK thing; that's a US thing. I imagine elsewhere as well. So the fact that you've got someone who's big, powerful, and noisy saying things that are eye-catching and headline-grabbing is good TV. New, true, and interesting used to be the mantra when I was a young pup reporter at BBC Merseyside, but the interesting part is probably the only bit that matters now. The battle for viewership is there. And then the
only thing, if I can just come in, the only thing I'd say about this media obsession, I do agree. I'm a habitual watcher of Newsnight, and I can't remember the last time when Newsnight wasn't completely dominated by Trump issues. But the only thing is, Joe, that what this man says is, or doesn't say, or is inaction, or is nod and a wink, is affecting a whole lot of other things than the United States economy. The way in which Israel is unleashed in Gaza, the way in which all the United States could do yesterday when they bombed people going to a Palm Sunday service was to issue condolences without any condemnation of Russia. The fact that Iran is, is about to be threatened with a military attack, that's all got to do with Trump as well.
Look, I completely get that, Jim, and I'm not questioning, the newsworthiness of it. But what I am questioning, and what I'm getting increasingly cross about, is that there is no holding to account. Now, I mean, we can say what we like in this country at the moment, and say this is ridiculous, he's behaving like a madman. But, there's a danger we look sort of frightfully smug and liberal and, all of that sort of stuff, which isn't really particularly helpful to anybody, which is why I asked Martin, where is the opposition? Because, it's fine. Show Trump's latest press conference, but then what we're not getting is a voice of opposition. And I think that's where it feels so skewed.
Yeah, I think that's strategic, though. I mean, if I was advising the Democrats at the moment, I would say keep doing what you're doing, which is say nothing, because the story is the split between the MAGA Trumps and the Republicans, and the likelihood, as the last week has shown, is that the number of missteps that Trump makes of his own accord, unprompted, are damaging his standing and damaging his kind of polling figures, and that in turn is impacting negatively on the Republicans. So, as a Democratic strategist, I would say, yes, step back, keep quiet, don't make it an us versus them conversation. Just let it roll through and play, and focus your attentions on the two things that matter. One of which is keeping your party united, which is a struggle still, because there's strong wings, shall we call it, of the different Democratic flavors, and let's get some quality candidates in place for the larger and more significant gubernatorial elections that are taking place next year, and the midterms themselves when they roll around. So we're all political fighters or media fighters. We like to come out, throwing haymakers and landing punches. But there's a moment, and this is probably one of those moments, when just staying in the shadows is actually a smart move from the opposition. What you want is civil war within the Republican Party, and if you can let them do it to themselves, all the better, I suppose.
James Carville's advice.
We could lend them one of the Tories. They're very good at advising on that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, that was to an extent.
Nigel's the man. He's even though he didn't get given a ticket and had to borrow one off a broadcaster, apparently he's very close to the president. So yeah.
Joe's best mate, and Laura Koonsberg's as well. They're fighting over him at the moment on bloody BBC programme again yesterday. He's going to be on there as many times as he was on Question Time.
Representation of the People Act, Frank. You may not have heard of it.
Is that right? When you've got 5 MPs, you're allowed on every week.
In the run-up to a local election campaign, when you're the main
and it's got to be Farage, of course it has. Yeah, okay. Well, she shouldn't have had him on so many times previously, Jim, should she? This defence of the BBC and Farage is ridiculous, Jim, given the fact that he's been on Question Time more times than anyone else, and now he's getting there with the Sunday flagship programme as well. It's absolutely nonsense, but we come back to that a bit later on when we're discussing UK politics. Martin, I wanted to get your view in terms of what you're saying. James Carville, I was going to mention, who was Clinton's advisor, of course, came up with that famous phrase, the economy's stupid. He's basically given the advice that you would give them, which is just stand back and allow them to fight like rats in a sack and make them look as daft as they are. So I guess that's what the Democrats are doing. But of course, we do usually expect, and what we did have during the chaos of Johnson and Truss, and a little less chaos under the Sunak government, was the press holding the administration to account. Now, I'm watching CNN, and that still seems to be pressing sort of buttons that the Republicans and the MAGA crowd wouldn't particularly like. But it's been notable that press conferences have almost been abandoned now. So you had Netanyahu in the White House last week. And of course, ordinarily, they would have gone into the big press conference, and that's where the serious journalists, if I can put it that way, would have had an opportunity of perhaps holding Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister's, feet to the fire. That didn't happen. Instead, Trump postponed the major press conference and said, let's just have our little fireside chat in the White House, and I'll call on the journalists who I want to ask questions. And of course, neither of them were asked anything that was challenging. So that's the first thing that, for me, sets alarm bells ringing. He's doing his utmost to start to undermine what, for me, is your first port of call in terms of scrutiny, and that is the press. So are people concerned in the States about that, or isn't it really registering?
Again, a vast nation with a wide range of views. We've also got a very diverse media spectrum here as well. So, we don't have the national focus, one story, one headline that takes place. You've got broadcasters who are perceived to be on the left, CNN, MSNBC, NBC, and then you've got those who are on the right, Fox and Friends, News Nation, etc. People are consuming what they want based on their own perceptions of themselves. They're not looking for that independent voice anymore. Who was I talking to? Was at an event, and he said, I don't call it social media anymore. I call it influence influence media. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, the idea that there's this social network of people exchanging views and thriving and growing off each other is gone. That's not what you belong to. I know if I look at my feeds that they reflect the things I already kind of believe in already. So we've got these echo chambers of things, and that's the story of the tape here when it comes to media. The kind of Washington Post exposés are a thing of the past. So we'll have to look at those differently. I think business is much more important than it's ever been as well in the United States, and the people who lead those organizations, whether it's Zuckerberg or Bezos or Musk and others, are the voices that people tune into more than maybe reporters and media types. And what they do, like I mentioned Tim Cook before, I mean, he is going to be the power broker if there is going to be some settlement between the Chinese and the Americans on this ever escalating tariff treadmill that they're on at the moment. It's people like him who are going to, be the people who deliver. So the noises that they make and the sounds that they make, both publicly and in private, are going to be what's important. And I think, I'm heading back over to Liverpool on the plane this afternoon, and I've got a couple of people I'm seeing, and they're asking me, because they've got US concerns, that they're like, how do we read the room better? And I think that's probably where most companies are right now. They're readdressing their crisis plans. They're saying, we don't know what's going to happen, but if it does happen to us, what are we going to say? And are we going to pick sides? How do we get our point across without being critical? Because you don't want to pick a fight with this administration because it's vindictive. So Jim's got a media ear for downtown's membership, an understanding of how the story gets told. Joe's got the political connections and understands what the vote winning aspects of that are. And I would put myself in public affairs world and say, how is this going to affect my business and my employees and my suppliers? And these are the challenges that people are on now. I don't think nobody's waiting for a big curtain reveal from the media, a gotcha moment. We can all see in plain sight and daily activity how Trump is, how he behaves, the language he uses, etc.
They did try, Martin. They did try to get him on insider trading, a suggestion that he tipped off his mates just before he made his latest reversal. That seemed to be an attempt to sting him.
Well, you saw that was video that the White House released of him saying he made 900 million, he made 2.5 trillion. They released that themselves. But just as an aside, here's how the media's changed. I don't know if you watch many of the press conferences from the White House, but the new press secretary is entertainment in and of itself. My daughter's at fashion school in New York City, and there's a new phenomenon now called conservative girl, which is a dress sense that has that hair that looks like it came off your mother, and highly buttonable tops and blouses. So it's all, you know, they've now created something that's desirous amongst you know, a new generation to look and behave in a certain way.
But she from that point of view, she is a class act, I think.
Very good, very good. Golf and tennis are upswinging at the moment with Gen Z. You know, wow. People are getting into this country club, conservative, small c, you know, kind of lifestyle thing. It's amazing how it spawns from, you know, something that we're railing against to something that's become desirous by others. So it's
right. Listen, I'm conscious of time, and I do want to move the conversation on to what we were talking about last week. So the tariffs thing will continue to be discussed and debated, and it's a subject we will come back to. I'm not going to ask you a very unfair question, Mars, of what Trump is likely to end up with on this policy, because he doesn't know himself yet, is what I honestly believe. So no point asking anybody else. But I was saying last week, you've mentioned the midterms, and I was wondering whether they'll even happen, or whether he'll sign some sort of executive order to stop them happening. And even if he doesn't do that, I'm noticing that an awful lot of electoral officials are being removed from office and replaced with Trump supporters. So that's a worry. That's a concern. It'd be a bit like Liam Robinson in Liverpool saying that all the people who are going to count the votes and the person who eventually calls the result is going to be a card-carrying member of the Labour Party. So that's a worry. And I wonder how we can trust that those results are going to be announced in an accurate fashion. But more worrying, I think, was what happened this week when a couple of individuals were targeted by Trump, and the Homeland Security official, Miles Taylor, was put under investigation through executive order. This is a guy who wrote an op-ed critical of the Trump 1.0 White House. And then there was a guy who wouldn't basically go against the result, the first. He wouldn't say the election was stolen. I'm trying to find his name. Can you remember his name, Martin?
I know the story, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But so he's up on a treason charge.
Yeah. So yeah, Chris Krebs. So he's been by executive order now put under investigation. And people might say, oh, well, it's two individuals. So can you imagine your government, particularly a government as vindictive as this one, putting you under investigation because you happen to disagree with the views that they expressed 4 years ago? And the point I was making last week, and I will make it again this week, is that if this was in Russia or in China, we would be throwing our hands up in horror and saying that this was further evidence of total breach of people's human rights. And of course, the wider implication of this, guys, is not just these two individuals, but he's basically saying to everybody in the country who's got a public voice and a public platform, you dare go against what my administration is saying, and I could sign an executive order to have you investigated. And it may not be to do with anything relating to politics. He could just say, I don't like the views you've expressed, so sign an executive order to get your tax affairs scrutinised. He's done the same with lawyer firms. He's got lawyer firms who've taken against him in the past, now in all sorts of difficulties and problems. He's got cities that don't want to comply with ICE moves. Their federal offices are going to be closed. This is tyranny, Martin. This isn't democracy. These are not the sort of things that we associate with America. So whilst we're all exercised with, inevitably, the tariffs and the moves he's making on these big geopolitical matters, domestically, he's busy doing things that, as I say, ordinarily we'd be horrified by, and is totally un-American. I can't get my head around it, Martin. I am genuinely worried that this guy is heading towards autocracy.
I think that we're in the fast lane of that, aren't we? We have a very curious system here for governance. The president is elected as the executive branch. Congress is our legislator and is meant to be the organisation that promotes and brings laws forward, and then the judiciary, the Supreme Court, ultimately is meant to interpret those and make sure the Constitution is protected by those rules. The little loophole is the executive order, the powers that are granted to a president to make moves because of emergencies. So you'll notice that recently Trump has started to refer to tariffs as fentanyl tariffs, because he's able to utilize the executive order in the manner he has, because he said that fentanyl is an issue of such importance that he can take actions against it. So that the tariffs are, about that. We know if we unpeel that onion, that doesn't stack up. So there's a moment coming where either the Supreme Court, unlikely, is going to push back and challenge some of these executive orders and the mandate they have. But really, that's where Congress, which has powers baked in, should be taking action. But as we said earlier on in this conversation, the Democrats aren't minded to bring that forward whilst there's such chaos working in their favour, and the Republicans don't know where their feet are at the moment. They don't know whether they are, Trump loyalists or whether they're Republican loyalists, and they're trying to get the read off, I guess, district by district, their own constituents and electors. So I think there's a fear that they're not moving quickly enough to kind of close some of those avenues down. But I would imagine that the conversation is taking place within Republican circles about how to do that. Jim?
I obviously we had this conversation last week, Martin, a bit, and we're very grateful for you giving your insights into it. I mean, I demurred from what Frank was saying. I have to say, in fairness to Frank, over the last week, a couple of further bits of worrying evidence. The way in which universities in the United States, which are seen by the MAGA people as nests of insurrection and left-wing nonsense, they've had a lot of their funding cut. I think we're going to have a lot of attention paid to the Meta case that's going before the courts. They're being prosecuted. But of course, Trump's made up with Zuckerberg, and apparently 2 people have been sacked from that commission, and we'll see whether there's pressure from Trump for the prosecutors to drop the Meta case. So that, I agree with Frank, the outlook is gloomy, but can I just focus on what he said about the midterms? I mean, I think Frank is now probably agreeing that the midterm elections will not be cancelled. But are you suggesting, Frank, that people in their large numbers, which they may well do, vote for the Democratic Party in the midterm elections, and these Trump appointees in all these electoral offices are going to commit mass fraud, knowing that they have got Democratic votes in their ballot boxes? They are systematically going to lie to the Congress for the vetting of votes, and therefore keep Republicans in office. I mean, that is a monumental thing to happen.
I think they're daft, but they're not that daft, Jim. So you will go to the races that are close. And where a Republican feels as though they've really won and the count is inaccurate, they will challenge that vote. And the ultimate call as to who wins that election will be one of Trump's placemen or women. That's dangerous.
So that's why primaries, which you don't really have in British politics, are interesting and important, because what does the slate of candidates that the Republicans put forward for some of these key contests look like? Is it, as you would have imagined a few months ago, MAGA, hard MAGA, and the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, would Laura Looper, the really far out there figures would be on those tickets? Or are the Republicans going to read the room better and realise that they could lose seats if their candidates don't have a more Bush-like, Reagan-like feel to them. So I think that the primaries is going to be a massive kind of indicator as to whether Trump's agenda is going to be curtailed a little bit by the Republican movement writ large. So I'm looking out for that. And the same with the Democrats. You know, are they going to put firebrands, AOCs, and others up for these kind of seats, or are they going to have candidates who perhaps come from a more centre-left progressive Democrat kind of wing of the party, because they've got more chance of picking up votes from disillusioned middle of the road Republicans. So there's a lot at stake on that one. I don't think that the machine, the deep state, as Trump would call it, but rational government, as the rest of us would refer to it, is going to roll over when it comes to some things like that. I think there are checks and balances. I don't think they're working particularly well at the moment, but they are there. You've also got to remember that it is the United States of America, and that the states hold massive amounts of power when it comes to these things, especially on electoral issues, and each of those is going to interpret things differently as well. So I live down here in Florida, which little Ron DeSantis has been our governor for a while now. We've got banned book lists, that were withdrawn from schools and libraries. My wife works in a bookstore, and they proudly display all the banned books for the tourists to come in and buy. So you fight back, right? But each state's going to interpret it slightly differently, so it's going to be, you're going to see that polarization I keep talking about again. What happens in Arkansas and Alabama and Mississippi is going to be very different than what happens in Vermont, New Hampshire and Maine. So.
The fact that we're even having the conversation, I think, is frightening and depressing. And also saw over the weekend reports that California are considering independence. So there you go. There's an awful lot happening in America. We could spend literally hours on what is happening over.
Well, there's a bill going through California at the moment to make it legal for students to live in their cars because the housing crisis is so bad. So we're talking about something at a kind of epidemic level, and people have got real problems going on in their lives.
Unbelievable. And just, you mentioned AOC there, Martin. We will have to go to a break in a second, but AOC, I saw £35,000 people turned up to a rally that she was speaking at over the weekend. So she's rattling a few cages, but as we know from the UK and Corbyn, you can get big rallies and fill them. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win an election. Listen, as I say, we could talk all day about American politics. We will come back to it week after week, I'm sure. But thanks, Martin, for your time. Stay with us by all means. We're going to talk about what's going on in the UK and the steel industry and a recall of Parliament on a Saturday, would you believe? So stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast with me, Frank McKenna, joined by Jim Hancock, Joe Phillips, and this week, Martin Littroff from across the pond. We talked an awful lot, exclusively about American politics in the first part of the programme. Now we're going to turn to domestic issues and, of course, that incredible situation at the weekend where Parliament was recalled, to put it in the words of many of the tabloids, save our steel industry. And Jim, ironically, last week I said to you that I was in despair reading reports that we may be about to lose our ability to produce steel. And lo and behold, the business secretary, the prime minister have stepped in and have come into this Scunthorpe plant and basically said, this is a key industry sector. We cannot afford to lose this huge piece of infrastructure, particularly in the current political climate. And I think we're heading towards re-nationalisation of steel. What did you make of it all? And a Saturday sitting for Parliament as well, James. We don't get many of those.
No, we don't. And as you know, I've been covering politics since the 1930s. But this is actually true. You know, I was in Parliament for the Falklands debate in 1982 after the Falkland Islands were invaded. If I was being very provocative, Frank, I might say to you that Sir Keir Starmer is following the lead of Nigel Farage, who's been calling for this action for many weeks. But rather than do that, let's focus on the issue itself. I mean, there seems to be to me two things. One is the cost of energy in this country, because obviously steelmaking is extremely thirsty in terms of energy, and the debate over Ed Miliband's zero carbon policy is very interesting, and the pressure's mounting for us to try and either make some subsidy concessions to the industries that use a great deal of energy. I mean, paper and board in Bury has always over the years used a lot of energy, and these are getting really penalised by that. So there is that, but the bigger issue is the influence of Chinese investment in the United Kingdom. It was interesting this morning, the trade union leader for, I think it's the union community, was reluctant to go along with the question of whether this company has actually literally tried to sabotage the plant by trying to sell off the iron pellets and the coking coal that was already there. They were trying to sort of sell it off. But, the articles that have actually said that, the idea that this company, British Steel, Chinese-owned company, is sort of something independent from the Chinese Communist Party is a fiction. And I think this raises a much wider issue of Chinese influence on this country.
But let's stick to the steel issue, Jim, because this is crucially important, and we can come back to the wider implications of trade with China, whether the plan should have ever been given to China over to Chinese ownership in the first place, I think is a major issue. But I think let's just focus on the political implications of this move, because I do think that we're heading towards re-nationalisation. Johnny Reynolds himself, the weekend, said it's likely that was the ultimate outcome. So rewind, we've made a bad decision in putting it in the hands of Chinese owners. The Chinese owners, we suspect, have been trying to run the plant down because the Chinese are the biggest producers of steel. And so therefore, if we are unable to produce our own steel, then that is going to be the likely source that we will go to. And then, of course, you have this added pressure now of a new world that we're coming into, where Labour are saying that they're going to produce an industrial policy which will rely heavily on infrastructure renewal. And of course, that means more steel. So all of these things have come together and made the government act urgently at the weekend. The criticism that would be made, Joe, of the government is that they haven't acted urgently enough. So let's take that on board for a start. But then secondly, and I know you want to get your teeth into this one, Joe, how bad was Badenoch? And she's basically said that she'd done a deal with this crowd, this Chinese company, and Johnny Reynolds, just without calling a liar, made her look a liar in the Commons on Saturday when he said, okay, well, what was the deal? Of course, there was no such deal. So she's had a really bad week, I think, Badenoch, for all sorts of reasons relating to British MPs being excluded from other countries, then this steel crisis, then saying that, we might look at reform, doing some sort of deal, and she was basically battered off by Farage, who said, why would we want to do a deal with you? But let's take your view on those two things. Government's response to steel, and then Badenoch and her performance.
Yes, the government's response is absolutely right. I don't know why they didn't do it a little bit earlier, because we knew this was the problem. The unions have been warning about it for a very long time. And there was something that was a little bit performative about recalling Parliament for this on a Saturday. They could have rushed it through last week. They could have done something. Johnny Reynolds could have made a statement in the House. There could have been an urgent sitting. There may have been other reasons. It might have been legal reasons that I don't know about. But there was a part of me that thought, come on, if you're going to do it and make a big deal of it, then the next questions are, well, when are you going to renationalise water, rail, electricity and other major parts of the infrastructure? So, but I think what they've done is good, and I think it's raised all sorts of questions about China, as Jim said, and we won't go into those. As for Kemi Badenoch, it is almost impossible to believe that on a Saturday urgent recall of Parliament, you've got Reform and the Green Party and the Labour government and the Liberal Democrats speaking with one voice, basically saying, yeah, we think this is a really good idea. Greens and Reform go, yeah, but actually you should nationalise it and you should do it now, which is an astonishing alliance. And Kemi Badenoch says, look at them on the Labour benches. They're rejoicing. They're building up huge debts for taxpayers. This is the beginning of sort of, communist rule. But I mean, she is so completely off the scale. There's a part of me that sometimes thinks, Liz Truss, Kemi Badenoch, who would you rather be stuck in a lift with? You wouldn't. You'd take stairs, wouldn't you?
Well, I think she's had a really bad couple of weeks, to the point where if the local election results go as we expect, she's going to be under pressure. And I wouldn't have necessarily said that a month or so ago.
There is an awful lot of whispers going on within the Tory party. But they reckon that she won't go until May next year.
Yeah.
Because they've got to find someone, and of course Robert Jenrick is champing at the bit, but not so much as Mrs. Jenrick, as we know. But do you really want to go into it now? They've got to get somebody in half sensible. I mean, it may be that Jim's predictions on Mel Stride come true.
Sir Mel Stride, by the way.
Oh, Sir Mel Stride, sorry,
and I tell you, I wasn't going to get into this, and in fact we won't until next week, but what an absolute farce that Sunak has been allowed a Prime Minister's resignation honours list as well. When are we going to dispense with this nonsense? Some of the shite on that list. Gove. How can Gove go to the Lords? Basically, listen, don't get me started.
Well, I look forward to
he's going to VIP lanes, all sorts of PPE contracts if we ever have another pandemic. Let's stick with the steel, though, because you're going to take me into areas I don't want to go into, and Jim's good at that. Jim, what do you think in terms of the politics of this? Interesting that you mentioned Farage. Let's not forget, he was the biggest fan ever of Margaret Thatcher, who privatised steel in the first place, and arguably is responsible for all the problems that we're facing now in terms of our big industries and our infrastructure. Let's also not forget that our departure from the European Union is what's really made the pressure on our energy costs high. And let me also remind you that the net zero targets that you called Ed Miliband's were actually set by the Tory party, and he's inherited them, and he would say is simply strengthen them so we can meet those targets. So we've basically decoupled all that. Where do you think politically we are? Because, as you mentioned, we've got local elections coming up, and it does appear that Reform are going to do particularly well. And to be fair to Farage and to Tice, we can go through all the detail of this and unpick an awful lot of what they're saying as hypocrisy, but they're playing a bit of a blinder, I think.
Yes, and just on Mrs. Badenoch, she visited the Lancashire elections to support Conservative candidates there, but didn't go anywhere near Runcorn and Helsby, and she's more or less run up the white flag as far as that's concerned. And I think, in terms of the local elections, she certainly has. She's expecting to lose lots of seats. I think from Labour's point of view, it's quite interesting. I do think they're trying to head off Reform and to a much lesser extent the Conservatives, because I don't think they fear them for the reasons that you've just been discussing. And things have come together. I'm not necessarily saying that all this was planned, but it's a sort of muscular Labourism to try and shore up that red wall. Steel, we're going to intervene on that. We want a country that's making things. The defence argument, John Healey, in my opinion, is playing a blinder as Defence Secretary, and it all goes towards that. And actually, even the benefits thing, which is causing a lot of angst inside the Labour Party, So you've got a sort of Labour Party that's sort of positioning itself to try and head off some of these populist policies that Reform UK put forward. So I think that's really interesting. I mean, there are questions about this. Joe's raised them. You know, the cost of all this is still unclear. Other industries could be candidates for it. I mean, how long are the blast furnaces going to carry on? I understand their shelf life is fairly short, but I absolutely believe that we should have an indigenous steel industry in this country, whether it's the electric arc or another process. And I can't remember the name of it, but there's another alternative for making primary steel. And so that's all there. But I think Labour's positioning is quite interesting. I think it's trying to sort of, you know, and obviously Lincolnshire happens to be a mayoral election there as well. I'm afraid I go back. I don't know if any of you will understand the reference. The reason why there's a Humber Bridge is because there was a by-election in Hull in 1966 where one John Prescott was elected. And, you know, a lot of people still say to this day, because it's not a particularly used bridge, but it was there because of a by-election. So sometimes these things happen.
And it's Andrea Jenkins, the famous middle finger woman, who was a Conservative minister, who was the mayoral candidate for Reform. So high-profile personality there. I saw you were trying to come in, Martin, to the conversation. I know that you obviously are still a keen watcher of UK politics, and I'd just be good to get your view on this from the outside looking in, so to speak.
I was just going to link it back to what we spoke to in the first half of the show, that, you know, here you are, as the Brits, talking about subsidising industries and putting up trade barriers, using taxpayers' money to make your steel cheaper than overseas steel. So you're re-nationalising core industries. These are the kind of behaviours that President Trump and his followers are railing against at the moment. So there's a little bit of a swimming against the tide here. You know, if we are going to go down this route of re-nationalising, which I think is a horrific mistake, I think there's a big difference between having sold it to the wrong person and having sold it at all, in terms of that. But it will have to be careful that if we've now got British government subsidised steel cropping up, you know, if it's just for domestic purposes, fine. But I don't think that the industry sustains itself that way, because it's, you know, high quality steel that they're talking about. So a lot of it get exported. So there's a clash there. I think there's a challenge of putting government money behind these things for these critical industries, and it probably might be a problem for Keir Starmer when he rocks up next time with Peter Mandelson in Washington to try and do a trade deal.
Yeah. As someone who is very, very experienced in the internal machinations of the Labour Party, Martin, we had Blue Labour. We had Labour Together. This new group apparently is starting to emerge, and Jim has referenced the sort of approach of this masculine, robust policy making in terms of intervention, and nationalisation has certainly been part of that. Hard Labour, apparently they call them themselves.
Hard Labour.
Hard Labour. So we wait and see who's going to be involved in that. Glassman, who apparently is quite close to Trump, is one of the characters in and around this group. But I think that this industrial strategy that Labour...
Has he jumped ships, has he now?
No, Glassman's still in the Labour Party. He's a Lord, but he is close to Trump, and he was part of the Blue Labour gang. So we see how all that starts to untangle, because Max Sweeney, of course, now is Starmer's policy advisor. He's his chief policy advisor, so he's on that page as well. But I just wondered, Joe, from your perspective, you know, we've said for a long time now, haven't we, the lack of a plan, the lack of a strategy seems to have hamstrung this Labour government for some time. Surely there's an urgency for them to produce this industrial strategy that they've been talking about for months now. And also the other thing that I think gives an opportunity to them is the new world order enables Rachel Reeves to finally say, surely, well, my fiscal rules are out the window, because they simply don't mirror the challenges that we're having to face now.
No, I completely agree. I mean, they had a terrible 6 months mainly of their own making, as we've often discussed here. But they are extremely fortunate, actually, because they now have the opportunity, because of the things that we talked about in the first half, and what Trump's doing in America, the growing threat of Russia, the continuing war in Ukraine. They now have an opportunity, because they've got this walloping majority. And it's good to have different factions within parties talking about industrial strategy. They need to be really clear. Rachel Reeves needs to say, yep, we're changing everything because everything has changed. They need to be absolutely clear, because this is their Achilles heel. Where does this industrial strategy sit with their desire for net zero and their green credentials? Because you can't have, coal-fired steel furnaces and special treatment of the car industry and all of those things aligned with, the desire for net zero. And it's the stick that Reform particularly used to beat the Labour Party, that net zero is costing us all money. Well, that's arguable. And the other thing that they've got, which is a big problem, but I think may be sorted out, is the Birmingham bin strike, because it's ever so easy for people to go, and the unions aren't taking a blind bit of notice, and you've got rats the size of tigers and all the rest of it. And, even Angela Rayner going there to sort it out didn't work. They're now having to call the army in. So, they've got many problems on many fronts. But what they really need to do is say, right, yes, we back British industry and infrastructure. That's absolutely key. And Europe. And stop fannying around and come out loud and proud to be closer to Europe and stop this tightrope, because I think that will give people some sense of security. The people who think that, all of these opportunities have arisen because of Brexit, they're deluded, they're going to vote for reform anyway. Now come out and be clear that that is the path of travel.
Show some leadership. I'll tell you an interesting sidebar to local elections, local government, and people sometimes think we're over obsessed with that. And you mentioned devolution, Martin, the fact that that's not really taking off in the UK in the way that we would wish to see it, with some fiscal responsibilities as well. But we did an excellent event this week at Downtown with Best for Britain and the West Midlands Growth Company, and some fascinating polling that Best for Britain were able to produce, saying that almost 60% of the UK now think that we need to get closer to the European Union, not go back in to the European Union, but a much better trade deal, and that our European partners are seen now far more trustworthy than the United States, which again was probably not the case just a few months ago. But the interesting comment from one of the West Midlands Growth Company guys is that they are fearful of the local election next year in the city council, which could result in Reform taking seats, of course, but ultimately there being a hung council. And what he was saying, it goes back to the point that we've all made, I think, today at some juncture. Certainty is what business likes, and this uncertainty that hovers over Birmingham and its future because of its city council is starting to make some investors think again about the attractiveness of Birmingham as a city to invest in. So politics does matter. It matters in terms of growth. It matters in terms of how businesses view you. And that Birmingham situation is a great micro example of the macro issues that we're dealing with when we're trying to attract investment into the country. Because James wasn't able to speak very often in the first part of the programme, I'm going to give him the last word and just try and summarise where you think we are as we enter the final week or so of the election campaign, which I have to tell you, I'm learning from both Conservative friends and from Labour colleagues. They're not having a good time of it, and they are really expecting a big spike in Reform support.
Yes, just two things quickly. I'm delighted not to have contributed much, because having Martin on and all his insights was absolutely fabulous. It's just one other thing on Europe. I commend to you the UK in an independent Europe, in a Changing Europe website. They had a big discussion about Brexit, and they said that whilst the Labour government has red lines around a single market, customs union, and free movement, there is very little prospect of all these things that the business secretary and the prime minister talk about, a closer relationship with Europe, even down to that nonsense whereby when musicians try and go to Europe, they have to have a separate certificate for their tubas and their drums and all that. Not a chance under the current circumstances. It's a very sobering and depressing thing, because I'm absolutely on the same page as you, Frank, on the need to do this, but that's the politics of it. Now, yeah, I think the local elections, I think, Reform UK will do very well, but the Conservatives have already written off, because they last fought these seats in 21 when Boris Johnson was on a high, having done the COVID vaccinations, so they're bound to lose seats. But the fact that they're talking it down anyway doesn't bode very well. It looks as if this woman Pochin, who actually I found out, do you remember Pochin's the builders instructor? She's apparently a scion of that family, probably will win it for Reform UK. I think the Liberal Democrats could do quite well. I think Ed Davies' principles, I see Joan Hednorm's coming off, nodding away here. Her stance on his stance on social care and taking a more robust attitude to Trump is going down well, so they could do reasonably well. And I imagine it'd be interesting to see what the Greens do, because there's been a move against a lot of the things they stand for recently. So it'll be interesting. So, but then the question will be, how will Reform councillors behave in office? Will they do their constituency surgeries? Will they have a clue about how local government operates? And I'm not making an equation here, but Martin and I will remember when the BNP made inroads in Blackburn and Burnley briefly at the early beginning years of this century. They were hopeless at being councillors. They didn't do their surgeries. They didn't interact with the local government structure. So that's what could happen. But it could be quite problematic for the governance of our shire districts after May the 1st.
We had that here with UKIP.
Go on, Joe. Last word to you then, Joe.
No, well, just to endorse what Jim said, and we had exactly that here when UKIP took a large chunk of Kent, and it was total chaos. And I think, you've got Richard Tice, you've got Nigel Farage, you've also got people who still think that Chris Whitty should be hung and that Gollywogs are cute, standing as candidates. I think that tells you all you need to know.
And the earth is flat. And just to, I suppose, demonstrate what Jim was saying in terms of the Liberal Democrats feeling quite chipper about the forthcoming local elections, the party that issues a press release on a weekly basis to recall Parliament, well, when it was recalled on Saturday, not many of them turned up for the debate, but there you go. I'm sure.
Well, mainly because Weir Hobhouse was stuck in Hong Kong airport.
There's one who got the excuse. The rest of them were obviously couldn't be arsed. So there you go. I don't want to be seeing any more press releases from the Lib Dems about recalling Parliament urgently for some considerable time. Anyway, on that note, and I have had the last word, as I always do. It's been great to see you, Martin. Hopefully we can get you back on whilst you're over in Blighty.
Look forward to.
And Jim, quick congratulations on another win for Argyle at the weekend. Everton had a last-minute winner, and then West Ham let us down on a treble, getting beat by that load of crap from across the park at Anfield. But there you go. We can't have it all, can we? I'm sure the next 7 days in politics will be as equally active, and we will be here to cover it all and hopefully talk about some of the issues that we've missed this week, not least that honours list that was produced by Rishi Sunak. If you've not seen it, because it has gone under the radar a little, have a look at it. It's an absolute bloody disgrace. Have a great week, everyone. We'll see you on Easter Monday.